My name is Daniel Reeves. I am 43 years old. I tell people I built my life with my hands, but that's not entirely true. I built it with my instincts, the kind that took me 30 years to trust and about 18 months to ignore completely. My father was a civil engineer in Columbus, Ohio, a quiet man who carried a level in his truck the way other men carry good luck charms. He believed in plumb lines and load-bearing walls. He believed that if something was going to stand, it had to be honest all the way down to its foundation. I inherited his faith in structures. I just applied it to the wrong one. I grew up in Worthington, Ohio, in a brick colonial on a street where the neighbors knew your name and borrowed your ladder and returned it before you noticed it was gone. My mother taught fourth grade at Worthington Hills Elementary. She had the kind of patience that made you feel, even when you'd done something terrible, that you were still fundamentally okay. I was their only child, and they gave me a childhood so stable and unremarkable that I sometimes think I spent the first decade of my adult life subconsciously trying to manufacture drama just to feel the texture of living. I didn't go far for college, Ohio State mechanical engineering. I liked the problem-solving, the clarity of systems that either worked or didn't. After graduation, I bounced around, a stint with a manufacturing firm in Cincinnati, 2 years doing infrastructure consulting in Indianapolis, before landing in Nashville in 2007. Right as the city was beginning its long, improbable transformation into something people actually flew to on purpose. I got into commercial real estate development, not the flashy kind, not luxury condos with rooftop pools and influencer launch parties. The unglamorous, load-bearing kind, warehouse conversions, mixed-use developments in neighborhoods the glossy magazines hadn't noticed yet. The kind of projects that required patience and a tolerance for city council meetings that ran past 10 o'clock on Tuesday nights. I was good at it, not brilliant, I want to be honest about that, but good, reliable. The kind of developer who returned calls and read contracts and showed up to walk the site even when the weather was bad. By 2014, I had a small firm, Reeves Property Group, 3 full-time employees, a respectable portfolio, and a reputation in the Nashville development community as someone you could do business with. That last part, I would later understand, is exactly what made me a target. My personal life was quieter than my professional one, which is a diplomatic way of saying I was not especially good at it. I'd been engaged in my early 30s to a woman named Catherine, a landscape architect from Brentwood, and we'd broken it off mutually and sadly after 3 years. The way you end things when there's nothing wrong exactly, just nothing quite right either. I had a condo in East Nashville, a black Labrador named Porter who required 2 long walks a day and was the reason I stayed reasonably sane. And a habit of working late that I dressed up as dedication, but that was mostly just easier than going home to quiet. I met Marcus Webb in March of 2015 at a private dinner hosted by a commercial real estate attorney named Gordon Chu, who collected people the way other men collected vintage bourbon, carefully. With an eye for provenance, Gordon hosted these dinners 4 times a year at his house in Belle Meade, 12 to 15 people around a long oak table. Always a mix of developers, attorneys, architects, financiers. The occasional city council member. The food was excellent and the conversation was better, and the unspoken rule was that no one pitched anything. It was purely social. Gordon believed that business relationships formed through friendship were more durable than ones formed through transaction, and in my experience he was right about that, right up until he wasn't. Marcus Webb arrived at that dinner with the particular confidence of someone who has spent years learning exactly how much space he's allowed to take up in a room. He was 41 then, 2 years older than me, with the kind of face that looked better as he aged, strong jaw, close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples. Dark eyes that moved fast and gave you the impression he was always calculating 2 things simultaneously. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, a navy jacket, no tie. He had an ease about him that wasn't performative. He laughed at other people's jokes without looking like he was waiting to tell his own. He'd come from Dallas, he said. Before that, Denver. He'd worked in commodities trading, then private equity, then pivoted into real estate development about 6 years prior. He spoke about his projects with specificity, square footage, zoning variances, lease structures, that told me he wasn't someone who'd bought his way into credibility without understanding the work. He'd done 2 significant mixed-use developments in Denver's River North District and was looking at Nashville as his next market. We ended up next to each other after dinner, on Gordon's back porch with glasses of Pappy Van Winkle that Gordon produced with the quiet pride of a man presenting evidence. And we talked for 2 hours. Marcus was funny and curious and asked good questions and listened to the answers, which is rarer than it should be. He had a daughter, he mentioned, 12 years old, lived with her mother in Denver. He flew back every other weekend. He said it with a kind of matter-of-fact sadness that made me like him more than I'd intended to. By the time I drove home that night, I'd given him my card and he'd given me his, and I'd thought, I would like to know this person better. We had lunch the following week at a restaurant in the Gulch, and then again the week after that. He was staying in an extended-stay hotel in Midtown while he looked at spaces, and he found Nashville's pace disorienting in the best way. He was used to cities that moved faster, he said. And there was something clarifying about a place that still let you think. By summer, we were having dinner regularly, sometimes with other people, sometimes just the 2 of us. He met my colleagues. I met his attorney, a sharp woman named Felicia Barnett who worked out of a firm in Charlotte and flew in for meetings. He came to my firm's 4th of July party on the roof of a building we just closed on in Germantown. We did this every year. Folding tables and coolers of beer and a perfect sightline to the fireworks over the Cumberland, and he stood with my project manager, Janet Ackafer, talking for 45 minutes about adaptive reuse projects in mid-sized American cities while the sky lit up behind them. And Janet told me the next morning that he was the most informed person she'd spoken to in years. I want to document all of this carefully because I think it matters, not just the betrayal but the relationship that preceded it. Marcus was not a cipher. He was not blank or hollow in the way con men are sometimes described, as though they have no interior life, only a performance of one. He had opinions and irritabilities and enthusiasms. He loved early American architecture and hated open office plans, and was an unreasonably good amateur cook who sent me, once, a photograph of a brisket he'd smoked for 12 hours for no reason except that he was proud of it. Whatever he was doing to me, he was also genuinely present in our friendship, and I have spent a great deal of time since then trying to understand how both of those things can be simultaneously true. In September of 2015, he came to me with a proposal. He'd identified a property in North Nashville, a former industrial corridor that was in the early stages of a rezoning push. 4 parcels, adjacent, totaling about 11 acres. The city was quietly encouraging mixed-use development in the area as part of a broader revitalization initiative. The parcels were currently held by 3 different owners, one of them an estate in probate, which had kept other developers from pursuing the assemblage. Marcus had done the legwork to make contact with all 3 ownership groups and had a preliminary sense that they were willing sellers if the right offer came together. His proposition: we form a partnership. He would contribute capital, significant capital, he specified in the range of $3 to $4 million, and relationships particularly on the financing side, where he had strong ties with a private equity fund in Atlanta called Meridian Capital Partners. I would contribute local knowledge, city relationships, and operational infrastructure, my team, my contractor network, my familiarity with Nashville's development process. We'd structure it as a 50-50 joint venture, a new LLC, and split profits on the back end. I was interested, more than interested. The North Nashville corridor was exactly the kind of undervalued opportunity that my firm was good at seeing before others did. And the capital he was describing would let us move faster and with more certainty than anything I could put together independently. I asked for 2 weeks to think about it. I called Gordon Chu first. Gordon had introduced us, and I trusted his judgment more than almost anyone in my professional circle. Gordon said that Marcus had come to him with references, two developers in Denver, both of whom Gordon had separately called, and who'd spoken about Marcus in terms Gordon characterized as genuinely enthusiastic. Not the careful diplomatic praise you give when you're trying to avoid saying something bad. I hired an outside attorney, a real estate and business transactions lawyer named Robert Huang at a firm on Church Street, to review any partnership documents before we signed anything. I felt good about that. I felt like I was being careful. We formed Reeves Web Development Partners, LLC in November 2015. I remember the day we signed clearly, a Tuesday afternoon in Robert's conference room, sleet coming down outside, Nashville doing its half-hearted approximation of winter. We shook hands across the table afterward and Marcus said, "This is going to be something," and I believed him. The first year was everything he described it would be. Marcus wire transferred $3.2 million into the LLC operating account in two tranches in December 2015 and January 2016. Our attorney verified the transfers. I watched them hit the account with the particular disbelief of someone who has always worked with smaller numbers. We moved on the North Nashville parcels, closing on all four by March 2016. The probate estate turned out to be the most complicated, 7 months of negotiations, 2 separate hearings. A beneficiary in Scottsdale who initially refused to engage, but Marcus had a patience for that kind of friction that I genuinely admired. He never rushed it and never panicked, and every time I started to feel the familiar anxiety of a deal in danger of collapsing, he'd walk me through the logic of why it was going to hold. We broke ground on what we were calling the Webb Reeves North Project, a mixed-use development, 200,000 square feet, ground floor retail and light commercial. 3 floors of creative office space above, in October 2016. I managed the construction side. Marcus managed the capital stack, coordinating with Meridian Capital Partners on the equity financing and with a regional bank in Atlanta on the construction loan. I wasn't on those calls as much as I probably should have been, but Marcus framed it as division of labor. I was operational. He was financial, and I accepted that framing without pushing hard enough on it. We had quarterly meetings, the two of us and our respective attorneys, where Marcus would present financial summaries that were detailed and coherent, and showed the project tracking within reasonable parameters. I reviewed them, I thought I understood them. Outside the office, our friendship deepened in the way that shared high-stakes work tends to deepen friendships. We'd gotten into the habit of Saturday morning runs along the Shelby Bottoms Greenway, Porter loping alongside us. And then breakfast at a diner in East Nashville where Marcus would order the same thing every time, 2 eggs over easy wheat toast. Black coffee, and we'd talk about the project and about other things too. His daughter Emma came to visit for spring break in 2017 and I took them to a Sounds game, and she was a quiet, perceptive 12-year-old who asked me during the 7th inning stretch whether I thought her dad was happy in Nashville, a question so precisely aimed at something I'd been wondering myself that I didn't know how to answer it. "I think he's building something," I said. She nodded like that was an answer and watched the field and didn't press me on it, and I've thought about that moment many times since. The first thing that didn't quite fit was small enough that I almost didn't notice it. In January 2018, I was reviewing a draw request for the construction loan routine. I signed off on these regularly, and I noticed that one of the line items, a contractor payment to a mechanical subcontractor called Halcyon Systems Group, was coded in the accounting software under a category I didn't recognize. I asked our bookkeeper, a meticulous woman named Sandra Klein, about it. Sandra looked at it and said it must be a category Marcus's team had added. She'd seen a few of those appear in the past couple of months, always for amounts under $50,000. Always associated with Halcyon Systems. I didn't know the name. I went back through our contractor roster and didn't find it. I sent Marcus a casual email asking about it, who's Halcyon Systems, how'd they get on the project. He replied within the hour. A mechanical engineering consulting firm he'd used on a project in Denver. He'd brought them in to review our HVAC design. Their invoice was legitimate. He'd meant to loop me in and it slipped through the cracks. He apologized. It was a completely reasonable explanation. I accepted it. I'm not sure even now whether I would have done anything differently in that moment. But I know that's when the thing that would eventually unravel everything first showed its edge. By spring of 2018, I was seeing the name Halcyon Systems appearing regularly in our financials, always in amounts that sat just below the threshold requiring my co-signature. Always categorized in a way that was technically defensible but slightly oblique. I mentioned it to Sandra again and she said, carefully, she was a careful person, that she'd been meaning to talk to me about it. Over the past 14 months, payments to Halcyon Systems had totaled just over $780,000. $780,000. I sat with that number for a long moment in Sandra's office, the afternoon light coming through her window at the angle it does in April, making everything look soft and a little unreal. I said, pull everything, every invoice, every payment record, every authorization. She put it together over the next 2 days. When she brought it to me, I closed the door and read through all of it slowly. The invoices were professionally formatted, itemized, entirely plausible looking. Services rendered: mechanical systems consulting, HVAC design review, energy modeling, equipment specification. The work described was real work that gets done on projects like ours. The problem, the thing that started a cold current moving through my chest, was that I could find no independent evidence that any of it had actually been performed. No reports, no correspondence. No record of any Halcyon Systems representative ever being on site. I didn't tell Marcus. I started a notebook that night, a plain black moleskine I bought at a drugstore on the way home, and I wrote down everything I'd found. The dates, the amounts, the categories. The absence of documentation. I didn't know yet what I was documenting, but I knew enough to know that I should. By June, I had identified 17 separate payments to Halcyon Systems totaling just over $1.1 million. I had also identified 3 payments to an entity called Cornerstone Logistics Consulting, totaling $340,000 with similarly thin documentation. And I had begun to notice, with the particular sick clarity of someone who has been willfully not looking at something for too long, that Marcus had been making unilateral decisions about the LLC's operating account movements, consultant payments, wire transfers in ways that were technically within his authority under our operating agreement, but that had never been flagged in our quarterly meetings. I hired a forensic accountant, privately. Her name was Diane Estep, a woman who ran a small firm in Franklin and who came recommended by an attorney I trusted. I gave her access to what I had without telling her yet why I had it. I told her I was doing a routine audit of our development partnership's financial records. She called me 3 weeks later and asked me to come in. I sat across from her desk on a Thursday morning in late July, Porter in the car downstairs because I'd been too distracted to take him home first, and she laid out what she'd found. Marcus Webb had been systematically extracting money from Reeves Webb Development Partners, LLC, for at least 22 months. The Halcyon Systems invoices were fraudulent. She'd run down the company registration. Found it was a Wyoming LLC formed in 2016 with a registered agent address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in Cheyenne. The Cornerstone Logistics invoices were the same structure. There were 2 other shell entities she'd identified that I hadn't found on my own. Total outflow to these 4 entities, $2.3 million. Additionally, the equity financing from Meridian Capital Partners, the Atlanta fund Marcus had described as a core part of our capital stack, had never, to the extent she could verify, actually been structured as described to me. The investment tranches I'd seen documented in our quarterly reports appeared to reflect a different arrangement than what was disclosed. One in which Marcus had substantially more control over the money and substantially different obligations to the fund than I'd been told. I drove home afterward and sat in my condo and looked at the wall for a long time. Porter put his head in my lap and I put my hand on his head and I thought, I built this with someone I trusted. Then I thought, I have to be careful, I have to be very, very careful. I called Robert Huang that evening. I told him to clear time the following morning. I said, something has gone wrong with my partnership. I need to understand exactly what I can do and what I can't do yet. He said he'd see me at 8. I opened my notebook and kept writing. Robert Huang had been my real estate transactions attorney for 6 years, but I'd never seen him the way I saw him that Friday morning in August, leaning forward, elbows on his desk, reading through Diane Estep's preliminary findings without saying a word. He read slowly and thoroughly, which was one of the things I trusted about him. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at me over his glasses. How much have you said to him since you found this? Nothing about this. We had a regular call last week about the construction timeline. I acted normal. He nodded slowly. Good. That's very good, Daniel. He told me several things in that meeting that I needed to hear, not all of which I wanted to. First, the operating agreement we'd signed in 2015 gave Marcus authority over financial management of the LLC's day-to-day operations. That didn't mean what he'd done was legal. It almost certainly wasn't, but it complicated the picture. Our agreement had not included some of the protective provisions Robert had recommended at the time. Provisions I'd agreed to soften because Marcus had pushed back on them, and I hadn't wanted to start the partnership on a contentious note. I should have held the line, I hadn't. Second, if I confronted Marcus directly, I risked 2 things. 1, he could transfer remaining assets or accelerate whatever exit he was planning before I could take legal action to freeze anything. 2, if this went to litigation or criminal prosecution, anything I said to him in an uncontrolled setting could become complicated evidence. I needed to be extraordinarily careful about what I put in writing, what I said on the phone, what I said in person. Third, I needed to retain a litigation attorney in addition to Robert. He gave me 3 names, all Nashville-based, all with commercial litigation and fraud experience. I called the first one, a woman named Patricia Morales at a downtown firm, from the parking garage before I drove home. I met with Patricia the following Tuesday. She was direct in a way that felt like a gift after weeks of trying to interpret things I should have been able to read clearly. She said the evidence I had was a strong beginning, but not yet sufficient for the kind of legal action that would give me the most leverage. I needed documentation of where the money had gone. Specifically, I needed to establish that Marcus had benefited personally from the transfers, not just that they'd occurred. She also wanted a complete picture of the Meridian Capital Partners arrangement. Because if Marcus had misrepresented that financing structure to me in a way that induced me to enter or continue the partnership, we had additional claims. She said, do not confront him, do not freeze the accounts yet, do not do anything that signals you know. If he's planning to disappear, we want him to believe he has time. I went home and opened my notebook. Here is what the next 4 months looked like from the outside, entirely normal. Marcus and I continued our Saturday morning runs. We had our Q3 quarterly meeting in October, sitting around the conference table with our attorneys while he walked through financials that I now understood were partially fabricated. Nodding and asking questions that were calibrated to seem like ordinary curiosity. I would get home from those meetings and sit at my kitchen table and write down everything I'd observed, his affect, any deviations from his normal presentation. Anything that might be useful to Patricia. He seemed, if anything, more relaxed than usual that fall. He'd found an apartment in a building in the Gulch. He'd been in the extended stay hotel for longer than made sense if he was planning to put down roots. And his decision to sign a real lease had struck me, before I understood what I was actually looking at, as a positive sign. Now I understood it differently. A man planning a disappearance doesn't need to lease an apartment unless the apartment serves some other purpose. I kept working with Diane Estep, who by November had constructed a comprehensive forensic picture of the money flows. The $2.3 million in fraudulent vendor payments had, she believed, been routed through the shell entities to accounts she was tracking through subpoenas we'd prepared but not yet served. There was also a significant question about the LLC's construction loan. Marcus had been the primary relationship manager with the Atlanta bank. And there were indicators in the loan documentation that the loan-to-value representations made to the bank might not have been accurate. If true, that introduced potential bank fraud, which was a different category of problem. Patricia was in communication with a white-collar criminal defense attorney at her firm, not because I needed a criminal defense attorney, she explained, but because she wanted a clear-eyed view of the criminal exposure Marcus might be facing, so she could understand his incentives. In November, Diane called me with something new. She had been tracking the shell entity's financial activity as far as she legally could without formal court process. And she'd identified something she described as unusual capital deployment. One of the shell entities, Halcyon Systems, had made a series of payments in 2017 and 2018 to a contractor registered in rural Dixon County, Tennessee. The contractor's name was listed as Cascade Site Development. The work category listed on their business registration was Custom Residential Construction and Site Preparation, Custom Residential Construction, in Dixon County. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Dixon County is about 40 miles west of Nashville, mostly rural, some small towns. It's not where you'd expect a sophisticated financial fraudster to park stolen money. You'd expect offshore accounts, real estate in cash-friendly markets, cryptocurrency. Not a rural Tennessee contractor, Patricia was cautious. She said it could be any number of things, a coincidence, a distant relative, a legitimate service provider Marcus had simply routed through the same entity for convenience. She didn't want me chasing something that led nowhere while we were building the core case, but I couldn't let it go. On a cold Thursday in December, I drove out to Dixon County. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do. I didn't trespass. I didn't contact anyone. I drove the county roads with a property records map I'd pulled from the county assessor's website, public information, freely available, until I found the parcel associated with Cascade Site Development's registered address. It was a 23-acre property on a county road that was barely paved, set back from the road behind a long gravel drive flanked by mature cedar trees. The house, or what I could see of it from the road, was not what I'd expected. It was significant. Not ostentatious, not visible from the road, but you could see enough of the roofline to understand that whatever had been built there was large. There was a gate at the end of the gravel drive. Metal heavy gauge with a keypad entry system. I didn't go past the gate. But I sat in my truck on the county road for about 10 minutes, looking at what I could see, and I thought about the man I'd had breakfast with every Saturday for 3 years. And I thought about his daughter asking me if he was happy. And I thought about the precise, practiced way he'd explain the Halcyon Systems invoice to me on a Tuesday afternoon in winter. And I thought, what are you building out here? I went back to Nashville and called Diane. I need you to pull every permit record for a parcel in Dixon County, I said, and gave her the address. She called me back in 48 hours. The parcel had been purchased in 2016 through a land trust, the beneficial owner not disclosed on the public record, which is legal in Tennessee. The property had been developed extensively since purchase. 11 building permits pulled between 2016 and 2018, including permits for a primary residence of approximately 6,400 square feet. A detached structure of approximately 3,800 square feet described in the permit as a workshop and storage facility, a generator system, a water cistern and rainwater collection system. And the one that stopped my breath when I read it, a permit for an underground structure, approximately 2,400 square feet. Described in the permit application as a storm shelter and utility vault, 2,400 square feet underground. I sat at my kitchen table with Porter asleep at my feet, and I read that permit record 3 more times. And I felt the ground shift under everything I thought I understood about who Marcus Webb was and what he was afraid of. I brought everything to Patricia in a meeting the second week of December. I laid it all out. The shell entities, the fraudulent invoices, the questionable Meridian Capital representation, and the Dixon County property, the permits, the underground structure. The connection through Cascade site development. Patricia was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "He's building a bunker," not a question, a statement. She'd seen something like this before, she said, in a securities fraud case years earlier, a defendant who had, over the course of years of fraud, been systematically preparing a place to go if everything collapsed. Not flee the country, go to ground, disappear domestically. A property in a rural area off the grid by design, stocked and equipped to be self-sufficient for an extended period. He was never planning to stay in Nashville, I said. He was never planning to be caught in Nashville, she said. There's a difference. She was already on the phone with her colleague on the criminal side. What we had, she said, was sufficient to approach the U.S. Attorney's office. The interstate wire transfers and the potential bank fraud gave them federal jurisdiction. But she wanted to move carefully because if Marcus got wind of anything before we had court orders in place, asset freezes, seizure warrants, he could disappear into that property and create a very complicated situation. She said, "Give me 2 weeks, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't change a single thing." I drove home in the dark, out to Granny White Pike and back through the neighborhoods I'd learned when I first came to Nashville. The city I'd spent 15 years building small pieces of, and I thought about what I'd found at the end of that gravel drive in Dickson County, that gate, that roofline. The permits for something underground. He'd been building his exit for years, right alongside the project we were supposedly building together. I went home. I opened my notebook. I wrote down everything. Then I called Diane and said, "I need everything you have on Meridian Capital Partners. Every document, every representation Marcus made about them in writing. I think there's more there." She called me back 4 days before Christmas. Meridian Capital Partners, as it had been represented to me, did not exist in the form I'd been shown. There was a private equity firm by that name in Atlanta, a real firm, a legitimate operation, but the investment relationship Marcus had described, and that appeared in summary form in our quarterly reports, had been significantly mischaracterized. The actual investment from Meridian was smaller, structured differently, and had been partially redeemed 18 months earlier in a transaction that had never appeared in any document Marcus had given me. The gap between what Marcus had told me the LLC's equity position was and what it actually was, approximately $4.1 million. Total amount I could now document that Marcus had misappropriated or misrepresented, over $6 million. I sat with that number in my living room on the 21st of December, 4 days before Christmas, snow on the ground outside in the light-polluted Nashville sky. And Porter asleep on the couch next to me, and I did not cry, which surprised me. I felt something older and quieter than crying. I felt the specific grief of someone who has understood, finally and completely, that a person they loved had been, all along, counting on them not to look too carefully. I thought about his daughter. I thought about what she would have to understand about her father. I thought, I am going to let him believe he has until spring. Then I opened a new page in my notebook and I started making a list. Patricia filed under seal in federal court in late January. The asset freeze order was granted. The U.S. Attorney's office, once Patricia had walked their team through what we had, moved with a speed that told me they'd been watching something in this territory already. They didn't say that exactly, but I could read it in how quickly they understood the architecture of what Marcus had done. The court order froze everything in the LLC's accounts. It also included, after a supplemental filing in which Patricia documented the Dickson County property and its connection to the shell entities, an order requiring Marcus to produce information about assets held in his name or through entities he controlled. We served Marcus through his attorney on a Tuesday morning in February. He called me 40 minutes after his attorney called him. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message twice. His voice was controlled, more controlled than I'd expected, and he said only, "Daniel, call me back, please." I did not call him back. I sat with my phone and his message, and I thought about everything I'd trusted him with, and then I called Patricia and told her it was done. She said, "Now we wait for him to play his hand." The confrontation, if you can call it that, didn't happen in a conference room or a courtroom or anywhere Marcus could have scripted or anticipated. It happened on a Tuesday evening in March at a community meeting in North Nashville that neither of us had chosen as a stage, but that turned out, in the strange way that life sometimes arranges things, to be exactly the right one. The meeting was at the Buchanan Street Community Center, a converted gymnasium that smelled of industrial cleaner and old wood, organized by the North Nashville Neighborhood Revitalization Coalition. A group of longtime residents and community advocates who had been watching the development of our project, and projects like it, with the complicated mixture of hope and suspicion that people in rapidly changing neighborhoods know better than anyone. They'd requested a developer presentation months ago, standard practice at a certain stage of a project, and it had been on the calendar since November. I hadn't canceled it. I'd thought about it carefully, talked through it with Patricia, and decided that canceling would be its own kind of wrong. The community had a right to hear about the project from someone, and I was going to be that someone. What I didn't know until 2 hours before the meeting was that Marcus intended to be there too. His attorney had called Patricia's office that afternoon. Marcus wanted to attend in his capacity as co-managing member of Reeves Web Development Partners, a status, his attorney argued, that had not yet been legally extinguished. Since the asset freeze and federal proceedings were still in their early phase and no court had yet formally removed him. Patricia called me immediately. She said it was a strategic gambit. He wanted to appear at a public meeting as a legitimate business partner, get his presence on the record, give himself something to point to. She believed he'd been advised that a public showing of normalcy might help him in the proceedings. Let him come, she said. You have everything prepared. Let him believe he can still manage this room. She paused, then added, let him perform. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office for a few minutes after that call. I thought about the man I'd had breakfast with every Saturday for 3 years, the man who'd talked about adaptive reuse projects while fireworks went up over Germantown, who'd send me a photograph of a 12-hour brisket just because he was proud of it. I thought about his daughter asking me if he was happy, with the quiet accuracy of a child who has already understood more than she's been told. And then I got out of the car, walked back to my office, and spent the next 90 minutes going through my materials one more time. I had spent 6 weeks preparing for whatever version of this moment arrived, not emotionally or not only emotionally. The way you prepare for something you've been building toward for months is different from the way you prepare for a surprise. It's quieter, more deliberate. After the court filings in late January and the asset freeze order, Patricia had sat me down in her conference room and walked me through what the next phase required. I couldn't lose focus, she said. The federal case was proceeding on its own track, the civil recovery proceedings were on another, and my job right now was to keep the project alive, keep my team intact, and document everything that happened between now and resolution. I'd done that. I'd worked with Diane Estep to organize the full financial narrative into something a non-specialist could understand, a clear timeline, a clear set of numbers, a clear account of how the money had moved. I'd worked with Patricia on what I could and couldn't disclose publicly without jeopardizing the federal proceedings. I'd been deposed by the U.S. Attorney's team in early February and had answered every question thoroughly and without embellishment. 3 hours at a table in a federal building downtown, which left me exhausted in a way that felt clean, like something had been lifted out of me and put somewhere it could be properly examined. I'd also thought carefully about the people who would be in that room on Buchanan Street. Their relationship to development in North Nashville was long and complicated in ways that had nothing to do with me or Marcus. Neighborhoods watched get redeveloped, residents displaced. Promises made and broken by people in nice jackets who spoke fluently about community and then built things for someone else. They had reasons for their wariness that predated us by decades. Whatever else happened at that meeting, they deserved honesty. I decided that before I knew Marcus was coming, and it didn't change once I knew, Janet Acoffer was with me that evening. I'd brought her because she'd done half the real work on this project. She knew the construction schedule, the contractor relationships, the city approvals, the community commitments better than anyone, and she deserved to be in the room. She also had the kind of steadiness under pressure that I've never quite understood and have always been grateful for. When I told her in the car on the way over that Marcus was going to be there, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay," in the way she says things when she's already done the calculation and arrived at calm. We got there at 6:15, set up at the front table. I put out the project materials, site plans, construction timeline, community commitment summary, and stood at the window for a moment watching the parking lot fill up. Marcus arrived at 6:40. He came in with a younger attorney I didn't recognize, alert-eyed, carrying a leather portfolio. Marcus was dressed the way I remembered him dressing for community meetings, dark jacket, no tie. The particular ease of someone who has spent years learning exactly how much space he's allowed to take and how to use it without appearing to try. He moved through the room with the same confidence he'd always moved with, nodding at a few people he recognized from prior outreach events, touching a shoulder here, a handshake there. Projecting the energy of a man who has arrived to be helpful. He saw me at the front and held eye contact for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a real smile, not strained, not performed. That's the part that stays with me most even now. In that moment, I don't think he fully understood yet, or perhaps he did and had calculated that he could still manage it. I've never been able to determine which, and I've stopped trying. He crossed the room and sat down at the table beside me as if the last 6 months hadn't happened. As if the court filings and the asset freeze and the federal investigation were administrative friction, temporary, something that his presence at this table could begin to correct. "Daniel," he said. "Marcus," I said. He turned slightly to survey the room, which was filling quickly. 80 people eventually, maybe 90. Residents, local business owners, a city council representative, 2 people from the mayor's planning office, a pastor from a church 2 blocks from the project site. A woman who ran an after-school program in the building next to our lot. A retired man named Harold who had lived on Buchanan Street for 41 years and had been to every community meeting I'd ever attended in North Nashville. Gloria Watkins, who led the coalition, was setting up at the podium with the brisk authority of someone who has run a great many meetings and intends to run this one well. Marcus was relaxed beside me. He was organizing papers, some kind of prepared remarks, it looked like, and consulting quietly with his attorney. He had the body language of someone who believes the next hour is going to go in his direction. I looked at what he was preparing and felt very clearly what Patricia had said on the phone: let him perform. Gloria called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. She introduced the project with the kind of specificity that told me she'd done real homework. She knew the square footage, the zoning variance history, the timeline of the assemblage, the construction loan structure in general terms. She framed it correctly, a significant development that had material implications for this neighborhood, and a community that had every right to full information about what was happening and who was responsible for it. Then she introduced us and invited a presentation. Marcus reached for the microphone. I put my hand on his forearm, lightly, briefly, the way you stop someone without making it a public confrontation, and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "I'll take this one." Something moved across his face. The smile didn't disappear exactly, but it changed quality, became thinner, recalibrated, like a light adjusting when something passes between it and the room. His attorney leaned slightly forward. Marcus sat back. I stood up. I spoke for about 20 minutes, and I want to try to describe what it felt like to do it, because it was different from any presentation I'd given before. I started with the project itself because the project was real and it deserved to be described honestly and with the care I actually felt for it. I talked about the 4 parcels, the 11-acre assemblage, the years it had taken to bring all 3 ownership groups to the table. I talked about what we were building: 200,000 square feet of mixed-use space, ground floor retail designed specifically for local businesses, creative office floors above. A public plaza on the south end of the site that had been requested by neighborhood residents in early community meetings and that we had written into the project commitments. I talked about the construction jobs, the local contractor percentages we'd committed to, the affordable commercial lease provisions we'd negotiated with the city planning office. I looked at Harold in the fourth row while I was talking about the plaza. He was listening with his arms crossed, not hostile, just careful, the posture of someone who has heard promises before. I held his eye for a moment when I got to the part about the lease provisions, and I could see him filing it away, assessing it. Then I said, I also need to be transparent with you about something that's happened, because you deserve to make decisions about your neighborhood with complete information. The room shifted. You could feel it the way you can feel a change in air pressure, not dramatic, just present. There has been a significant breach of fiduciary duty in this partnership, I said. Federal proceedings are underway. My former business partner is the subject of those proceedings. The project itself is protected by court order and will continue. I am committed to seeing it through under restructured ownership with the same community commitments we made at the outset. I paused. I'm telling you this because you have a right to know who you're doing business with and what's happened. The building on this site is going up. The people responsible for building it are going to be honest with you about everything. Marcus stood up. He did it smoothly, the way he did everything, no abrupt movement, no visible agitation. He straightened his jacket slightly and said, in the voice of someone exercising restraint, I think there are some important facts that Daniel is characterizing in a way that doesn't reflect the full picture, and I'd like the opportunity to, Mr. Webb. Gloria Watkins's voice from the podium at the side of the room was not loud. It didn't need to be. Are you a named party in the federal proceedings Daniel just referenced? A pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which is a long time in a quiet room. That's a complicated yes or no, please. Another pause, shorter. Yes, he said. But the context is important and I think the community deserves. Thank you, Gloria said, with the completeness of someone closing a door. Daniel, please continue. Marcus stood for a moment longer than he should have. His attorney touched his sleeve. He sat down. From the third row, a man I didn't recognize raised his hand. He was perhaps 65, in a gray cardigan, with the particular composed attention of someone who has spent a career asking precise questions in rooms like this. He introduced himself as a former assistant U.S. attorney, retired, who lived 2 streets over and had come because his neighbor had mentioned the meeting. He asked 3 questions, addressed to the room rather than to any specific person. What was the structure of the asset freeze? What was the current status of the LLC's management authority? Was the construction loan at risk? The questions were not hostile. They were the questions of someone who understood exactly what they were asking and wanted the answers in the record of this room. I answered the first 2. For the third, I said that our litigation team had taken steps to protect the construction financing, and that I would be happy to provide written documentation of the current loan's status to the coalition within the week. The former prosecutor nodded and sat back. I reached into the folder I'd brought and placed on the table, and I took out a single-page document, the executive summary of Diane's forensic findings, reviewed by Patricia. Stripped of anything that would interfere with the federal proceedings, but clear and specific about what had occurred. I had brought 12 copies. I handed the stack to Gloria Watkins, who read the top sheet for about 45 seconds, then passed the stack to the person beside her. Marcus watched the papers move through the room. He watched people's faces as they read. He watched the room understand, page by page, row by row, in the particular quiet way that people absorb information when they've already suspected something and are now being given its shape. He stood up once more, and I believe he intended to speak, but his attorney stood with him and said something low and direct into his ear, and Marcus stopped. He picked up his portfolio. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the door with the measured pace of someone who is not going to let a room see him hurry, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was not loud but that everyone heard. The room was silent for a moment. Then Harold in the fourth row uncrossed his arms. I answered questions for another 50 minutes. Good questions, detailed, skeptical, fair, about the timeline, about the ownership restructure, about what the community commitments were worth if the partnership was in legal jeopardy. I answered everything I could answer and said clearly when I couldn't answer something yet and told them why. By the time Gloria adjourned the meeting, I had given my card to 11 people and made 4 specific follow-up commitments in writing, in front of the room. Janet and I drove back to East Nashville in the dark without saying much for the first several miles. Then she said he thought he could still walk into that room. He did walk into that room, I said. Right, she said. And then he walked back out. The federal indictment came down in April, on a Wednesday morning that arrived like any other Wednesday, gray sky, Porter needing his walk. The coffee maker making its particular sounds. Patricia called me while I was on the Greenway, and I stood in the cold with Porter circling me on the leash and listened to her read the counts. Wire fraud, bank fraud, mail fraud. 4 counts total, each one specific and documented in the way that federal charges are when prosecutors have had months to build carefully. The dollar amount in the indictment was $6.4 million, somewhat more than the $6.1 million Diane and I had assembled, because the federal investigators had identified several transactions we hadn't. That's the nature of a federal investigation. They go further than you can go alone. The Dixon County property was seized pursuant to a forfeiture order the same week. The agents who executed the seizure prepared an inventory that I was later given access to through the civil proceedings. And I read through it one evening in my kitchen with a particular kind of attention, the way you read about a place you've driven past but never entered. The underground structure was 2,200 square feet, slightly smaller than the building permit had specified, which suggested the final design had been modified during construction. It had been outfitted with extraordinary care, 18 months of freeze-dried food, organized by category and rotation date. Water storage and filtration sufficient, the inventory noted, for years of single-occupancy use. A diesel generator backed by a 500-gallon buried fuel reserve. A full medical supply inventory including a dental kit, which I found, for some reason, more unsettling than anything else on the list. Communications equipment, shortwave radio, encrypted satellite phone, a battery of backup power systems for both, a gun safe containing legally registered firearms, and a library. Several hundred books carefully shelved along one wall of the main room, organized loosely by subject. Fiction, history, architecture, philosophy. The inventory listed them only in categories, not titles, but I noted that the architecture section was substantial. He had loved early American architecture, genuinely. I'd known that about him for years. Watched him spend 20 minutes at a project site once explaining the load-bearing logic of a 19th-century warehouse to a contractor who didn't especially need the information but listened. Anyway, because Marcus's enthusiasm was the kind that made you want to be interested. He'd been building his retreat while building a life with me. The 2 projects had run alongside each other for years, funded by the same fraud, planned with the same patience. What struck me most reading that inventory was not the scale of what he'd prepared but the duration. He hadn't panicked and bought land and hired a contractor when things started to feel dangerous. He'd started in 2016, the year after we formed the partnership. He'd been building his exit from the very beginning. I thought about what it means to live with 2 architectures simultaneously. The one you show people, the Saturday runs, the diner breakfasts, the project meetings, the fireworks over Germantown, and the one you pour your real resources into, underground, where no one is supposed to look. I've never been able to decide whether the surface architecture was entirely performance or whether some of it was genuinely him. Whether the friendship was a function of the fraud or whether the fraud was somehow separate from the friendship, running in a parallel channel that he kept carefully insulated. I don't think I'll ever know. I'm not sure it matters. He pled guilty in September to 3 of the 4 counts. The bank fraud charge dropped in exchange for a cooperation provision that his attorney had negotiated with the government. The plea agreement included full restitution, which is the legal way of saying he agreed that the obligation existed. The practical question of how much of the $6.4 million I would actually recover was something Patricia was carefully honest with me about. The seized Dixon County property and the frozen LLC assets represented a partial recovery. The shell entities had been liquidated by the time the government reached them. Their balances moved through a chain that would take years of civil litigation to fully trace. He was sentenced in December to 7 years. I did not attend the sentencing. I'd thought about it. Patricia said it was my right and that some of her clients found it meaningful, but I decided it wasn't what I needed. What I needed was already happening. The building on Buchanan Street, the restructured partnership, the work that was still real and still mine. The aftermath of something like this is not a single event. It doesn't resolve on a schedule. It extends longer than you expect and arrives in rooms you didn't anticipate. Gordon Chu called me the week after the indictment. He is a dignified man and he was dignified about this, which I want to note because it would have been easy for him to be otherwise, to minimize his role. To emphasize the limits of what he could have known, to retreat behind the fact that Marcus had fooled a lot of careful people. He did none of that. He said, "I introduced you, I vetted him as well as I knew how, and I was wrong. I'm sorry, Daniel." Not elaborate, not overapologized, just honest. I told him I didn't blame him, which was true. The people Marcus deceived were not naive or careless. They were careful people: Gordon, Robert Huang, the developers in Denver who'd given him reference, the bank in Atlanta, the real Meridian Capital Partners Fund. And me, who had been deceived by someone who had made a practice of deceiving careful people, and who had learned, over time, precisely how much effort a careful person's defenses require. That's a specific kind of predation, and it doesn't work on foolish people. It works on people who believe that sustained trust has been earned. Robert Huang and I had the most difficult conversation of the aftermath. I'd needed to have it for months, and had been putting it off in the way you put off things that are necessary and uncomfortable. We met for lunch at a restaurant in the Gulch in October, a few weeks after Marcus's plea. And I told him that the provisions in our original operating agreement, the ones he'd recommended and I'd agreed to soften because Marcus had pushed back on them, had been consequential. That if we'd held the line on co-signature requirements for transfers above a lower threshold, on quarterly independent audits, on my approval rights over vendor relationships, the fraud would have been much harder to execute and much easier to detect. Robert didn't flinch. He said, "You're right. I should have held firm on those provisions regardless of what your partner wanted. That was my job." He paused. "You also wanted to believe the partnership was going to work. You didn't want to start on a contentious note." I understood that and I accommodated it when I should have pushed back harder. We sat with that for a moment. "It's both things," I said. "It's both things," he agreed. That's not absolution and it's not assignment of blame. It's just the honest accounting of how things actually went, which I've come to believe is the only kind worth keeping. Sandra Klein, my bookkeeper, had been the first person to notice that something didn't fit. She'd brought it to me carefully and professionally, the way she did everything. And I want to be clear about what that cost her: the uncertainty of flagging something to her employer that implicated his partner, not knowing how it would land, not knowing whether she was right. I gave her a meaningful raise in January and I sat with her and told her specifically what she'd done and why it mattered. She received this with the same careful professionalism she received everything else, and then she said very quietly, "I just thought you should know, that's all." That's what it came down to: a person who thought someone should know and said so. Janet Acaffer had known something was wrong before I told her. She hadn't had the specific information, hadn't seen the forensic accounting or the shell entity registrations, but she'd felt a disturbance in the way the project ran. Certain decisions that arrived without explanation. Certain conversations that Marcus redirected with a smoothness that, in retrospect, had the quality of practiced evasion. When I finally sat down with her in February, a week after the court filings, and laid out everything, She listened with her characteristic stillness, not shock, not vindication, just absorption. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been carrying this by yourself?" "Since August," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you caught it. And I'm glad you built something real enough that it's still standing." She was right about that, and I've thought about it often since. The project was real. The 11 acres were real. The concrete we'd poured and the steel we'd ordered and the relationships we'd built with the city planning office and the contractors and the community, all of that was real. And it belonged to the work, not to Marcus. Fraud is parasitic, it attaches to something genuine and draws from it. But the thing it attaches to remains, and when you cut the parasite away, the genuine thing is still there. The building on Buchanan Street is going up. It took 8 months to restructure the financing after the proceedings began. Patricia and I worked through a complicated sequence of steps, unwinding the Meridian Capital relationship, negotiating with the construction lender, bringing in a new equity partner. A regional fund I'd worked with on a smaller project in 2013 and trusted, and there were weeks in there that felt like trying to rebuild a car engine while the car was moving. But it held. The construction loan closed with the new structure in November, and we broke ground again in January, a year after the federal proceedings had begun. I walk the site every Thursday. It's a habit I established in the first weeks of construction before Marcus, and I maintained it through everything. Even in the months when walking the site meant walking through a project that I wasn't sure would survive. There's something grounding about being present for a building as it rises. My father believed that. He took me to job sites as a kid, let me put my hand on the concrete when it was fresh before it set. He said, "This is what honest work feels like. Solid, true, the same all the way down." Harold from the fourth row came to the site in February. He came on a Thursday, which surprised me. I hadn't told him about the Thursday habit, and he stood at the fence line and watched the foundation work for a while without saying much. I stood with him. After several minutes he said, "My grandfather built houses in this neighborhood, that's why I'm still here." I didn't say anything, I just listened. He turned after a while and walked back toward Buchanan Street, and I watched him go. That felt like something, not resolution exactly. More like an agreement, unspoken, unenforceable, the kind that only holds because both people choose to honor it. I am 44 years old now. I live in the same condo in East Nashville where I lived when Marcus arrived in Nashville, which sometimes strikes me as a kind of anchoring, that through everything, the coordinates stayed the same. Porter is 9 now, graying at the muzzle, requiring his 2 long walks a day with the same cheerful insistence he's always had, which I appreciate more than I could adequately explain. I have thought about Marcus in a way that I've had to learn to hold carefully, at arm's length, with both hands, the way you hold something that you know might not be safe to set down. Not forgiving him, that's a word I don't think I'm in a position to use yet, and I don't know if I'll arrive there. But I've tried to understand him, or at least to understand the structure of what he was, because I think that's the honest work of having been deceived. He was not a cipher. That's the thing I keep returning to. He was not hollow, not blank, not performing a personality over an empty interior. He had enthusiasms and irritabilities and real feelings about early American architecture and the correct way to smoke a brisket. He loved his daughter with what seemed to me like genuine pain, the particular love of a parent who has arranged his life in a way that keeps him at a distance from the person he loves most. Whatever he was doing to me, he was also genuinely present in our friendship, and I have spent a long time trying to understand how both of those things can be simultaneously true. I think they can be. I think that's one of the more uncomfortable things I've learned from this. That the same person can hold both a genuine relationship and a systematic betrayal, not because one cancels the other out, but because people contain more than one architecture at a time. He had the surface one and the underground one, and both were real, and they ran simultaneously for years, funded by the same source, maintained by the same intelligence and patience. The underground structure in Dixon County is going to be demolished, the federal marshal's office informed me in a letter last spring. The property will be liquidated as part of the forfeiture. The land itself, 23 acres on a barely paved county road, flanked by cedar trees, will eventually pass to someone else, who may farm it or build on it or simply let it go back to whatever it was before Marcus found it and decided it was the right place to disappear. I drove out there one last time in November on a cold, clear Tuesday morning, before the demolition order took effect. I parked on the county road and sat in my truck and looked at the gate, the same gate, the heavy gauge metal, the keypad, and tried to feel something conclusive, some version of ending. But it didn't come that way. It never comes that way. It came in fragments over the months, small moments of understanding that arrived when I wasn't looking for them. The night I realized I'd gotten through a full day without thinking about him. The morning I walked the site and felt only pride and not anger. The afternoon Harold came and stood at the fence and told me about his grandfather. My father used to say that a building is only as honest as its foundation. He meant it as engineering, as a practical statement about concrete and steel and load-bearing mathematics. But I've come to understand it as something broader, something that applies to every structure a person builds. In business and in friendship, and in the choices you make about who you extend trust to and how far. What Marcus built underground in Dixon County, in all its careful preparation, the food stores, the medical kit, the library, the 2 books I'd recommended, held nothing. It was a structure built to house a man who was planning to run, and when the moment came, it couldn't save him. Not because it wasn't well built, technically speaking, but because a foundation of fraud can't bear the weight of a life. It sinks, it shifts, it fails at the moment of real pressure, which is the only moment that matters. What I built, the project on Buchanan Street, the relationships with Janet and Sandra and Robert and Gordon and Patricia. The slow, careful work of 17 years in a city I chose and committed to, that's still standing. I put my hand on the foundation concrete on a Thursday afternoon in early winter, the sky low and gray and the site quiet around me, and I felt the cold of it and the solidity of it and the precise, unremarkable truth that it was exactly what it appeared to be. Honest material, poured correctly, cured, capable of holding up what would be built above it. That's enough for now, and for a long time I think that's enough.